Welcome to Artist Tales, a podcast that features and celebrates artists from different walks of life. I'm your host, Heather Martin, and in this episode, we're unraveling the story of a man who knits not just garments, but powerful conversation and cultural bridges. My guest is Kirk Dunn, a Canadian textile artist, actor, and writer, better known as the Knitting Pilgrim. For over 15 years, Kirk devoted himself to crafting stitched glass, a monumental triptych of knitted panels that mirror the grandeur of stained glass windows. But these aren't just tapestries. They're bold reflections of faith, empathy, and the threads that bind us together. Through his one-man show, The Knitted Pilgrim, Kirk fuses storytelling, visual projections, and textile art to explore the common ground and conflict between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Co-written with his wife Claire Dunn and directed by Jennifer Tarver, the show has taken Kirk from Canada to Europe. His knitting carries weight, literally and metaphorically. Weighing over 90 pounds, his tapestries challenge xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia, and offer healing through compassion. Whether he's hosting workshops, inviting audiences to knit during performances, or sharing interfaith dialogues on his podcast, The Knitting Pilgrim Talks, Kirk uses every stitch to mend our fractured social fabric. Welcome, Kirk.
Thank you, Heather. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's great to have you as a guest. So I know I've done the intro for you, but would you like to tell us a bit more about yourself and how you got into knitting?
Okay. Well, I got into knitting, I think, because I was an actor. Actually, my first job out of theater school, I did this a touring kids show. So we were driving around the province in a van, doing a show about gender equity. And the idea was that anything that girls can do, boys can do. And anything that boys can do, girls can do. So I was cast as a 12-year-old boy, opposite another actor was playing a 12-year-old girl. And our relationship in the show was very much, if you can do that, I can do that. Anything you can do, I can do better. And that turned out to be our relationship, in life. So we were up in Northern Ontario, and we went into a trading post. And I saw these beautiful hand-knit sweaters there. And I said, I think I'm going to buy one of those sweaters. And my friend looked at them and said, buy the sweater. I could knit one of those sweaters. And I thought, well, if you could knit that sweater, I could knit that sweater. And so that's what I did. I had my girlfriend at the time had just knit me a sweater. So I figured the big surprise would be to knit her a sweater in return. And I was also working as a security guard in a hospital and doing the midnight shift on the weekends. And so I had lots of time to knit. And so I got really good at knitting sweaters. I knit my entire family these big, huge, thick Icelandic sweaters. And so the knitting stuck. It was something I loved to do. I had lots of time to do it as an actor and as a security guard, lots of sitting around and waiting. And I loved the color of it. I loved the creation of it, just that magic of being able to take something that was basically a ball of string and turn it into a wearable piece of art. It just seemed like sorcery to me. I loved that act of creation. And so I picked up knitting and stuck with it.
And what was the reaction when you started knitting and particularly doing the sweaters? I mean, I know you mentioned the Scandinavian sweaters, but, how did people react to that?
Yeah, some people thought it was a bit strange for, what's a guy doing knitting? But actually, ironically, the thing it did was it got me some really good attention too. I remember I was getting onto the subway with a fellow actor. He and I had done a show, and I got onto the subway and pulled out my knitting. He said, "What are you doing? Pulling your knitting?" He said, "It's gonna be fine. Don't worry about it." And just then, the doors opened, and a beautiful young woman walked in, and she looked at me sitting there knitting and said, "Oh my goodness, you're knitting? That's so fabulous!" And she came right over and sat right down beside me, and we had this amazing conversation. And this was a girl who was like out of my league. There's no way I could ever strike up a conversation with her, but the knitting did it for me. And so, of course, my acting buddy looked at me afterwards and said, "Okay, that's a pretty good idea. I see. Anyway, so that was one of the things, I found certainly like on the whole, I was going to say on the whole, but like 99% of the time, every response I got for being a young man who knit was positive. And people thought it was unusual and refreshing and a really great thing. And so I was always getting positive reinforcement for it.
And more recently, I mean, you've touched on certainly it's seen as unusual. It's seen that women tend to do it, but there is a culture of men knitting. I mean, I've come across it a bit more recently, particularly on things like Instagram and other social media platforms. And it's as you say, it's really refreshing, to see it kind of challenging those stereotypes.
Yeah, absolutely. And the pendulum of history swings back and forth and back and forth. And back in medieval times, there were knitting guilds that were male only. Like you had to be a man to knit. And so there was a time in society when it was a male thing, and then it's also an incredibly functional and what's the word, individualistic or self-disciplined and you're basically taking care of yourself by knitting. Like sailors in the Second World War would knit their own sweaters, and fishermen would repair their own knitted pieces. Because you basically it was a life skill. You're out on the water. You need to stay warm. A wool sweater is the way to do it. If something happens to your wool sweater, what are you going to do? You're going to fix it. Or you need one. So is anybody else around to knit it for you? No. So you knit it yourself. So it's very much a something like that too. And again, I think it's that act of creation. And I think too that I'm hoping that our society is progressing a little bit. And I think that certainly for many years it was seen as women's work, and partly because women showed more care, I guess, and their place in the family was to take care of others and to clothe people and to care for and comfort people. And knitting was a great way to do that, because you make something for someone in your family or someone you love or care about, and they have this warm, comfortable, comforting article of clothing that's got a real history to it and that's got some sentimental value to it. And that's a beautiful thing. And I think now there is much more permission and understanding for men to do that as well. Like we can care for people. We can do the same things. We can craft things with our hands. It is handiwork. It is a craft, and anybody can do it. So I think it's becoming much more acceptable and much more celebrated, I think, for everyone to do it, for men, women, kids, adults, anybody.
And just moving on to some of the projects you've done, when I was kind of finding out a bit more about you, it's really quite fascinating what you've been up to be fair. So I'll start off, as I've mentioned in the introduction, about stitched glass and that triptych. So would you like to tell us a bit more about that project?
Yeah, so I had begun designing my own sweaters and things, and was really enjoying, the knitting, and wanted to take things to the next level. And I was told by the executive director of the Textile Museum of Canada that the way to do that was to knit an installation, an actual piece of art, as opposed to a piece of clothing or a garment. And so I was looking for just something to knit, and this is just after 9/11. And my personal history is that I am a PK, I'm a preacher's kid, and I grew up as the son of a Presbyterian minister here in Canada. And so I grew up in the church, and I actually had a very positive experience in the church. And I remember being aware very early on as a child that a lot of people did not have a positive experience in the church. And I didn't know why that was. Because my father's theology was very inclusive and very understanding and open and about love and acceptance and caring and doing the right thing and making the world a better place. And, there wasn't, I was really seeing the downside to it. And it wasn't until, as I grew, I noticed that other people had some issues with their history with the church. And in fact, with all, I think, religions, they're all imperfect because, well, they're all based on people, and we people are very, very imperfect. And so anything we touch, we kind of screw up. And that's what we do. And so I was looking at what had happened after 9/11, and I was looking at this relationship between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and wondering why it was that these three faiths, they're all based on the same thing. Basically, they all come from Abraham, all Abrahamic faiths. And they're all pretty much saying the same thing. They really are. And if you actually speak to the people at the highest level, the ministers and the priests and the scholars and the rabbis and the imams at the highest level, they would all really admit, like, yeah, we're all saying the same thing. They would say that. And yet I wondered, why was it that they're having such a hard time getting along? Like, what did that happen? How did that happen? What's the past history there? And where's the common ground? And how can we celebrate and remember the common ground and use that to, as a reminder to move forward? And in looking at these three faiths, I discovered, of course, that there was much more common ground than there was, things that set them apart. And so that's what I tried to capture in those tapestries. And the thing was, I didn't. I told the Arts Council that when I got the grant, I said, "This is going to take me about 10 months." But of course, it ended up taking me 15 years, and a lot of things changed over that time. And I didn't know what I was doing when I knew a little bit about Christianity, of course, because I grew up in the church, but I didn't know anything really about Judaism, and next to nothing about Islam. And so finding out about those faiths and studying them and asking about them and looking into them, and I made lots of mistakes. I made a fool of myself a number of times, and I just had this up and down roller coaster ride of trying to get these tapestries finished. And at the end, because it had taken me 15 years, that's all I had. And as an artist, you don't have any reputation if you've only got one project. I mean, you haven't had any exhibitions, you haven't established a name for yourself, you haven't worked with the gallery. So that's the place I found myself in. And my wife, Clara, and I decided to go to the problem for the solution. And the problem was that, this is the only thing I had. And so I said, okay, well, if it's the only thing I had, then let's write a one-person show about it. And that's the way we'll get it out there, by telling the story. And I was a bit nervous about that because it was my story. I didn't think it was very interesting. I'd spent 15 years really close to it, and I thought it was a disaster as opposed to anything to really celebrate. But I listened to the people around me mostly, and we created the show, and it turned out to be a huge hit. And it actually speaks to people on so many levels. Like, while it's true that nobody else has ever knit 3 full-sized tapestries that look like stained glass windows, everybody has got some experience of biting off more than they can chew. And that the journey of an artist of coming with a great idea and trying it and failing and it being a disaster, and then trying again and getting it closer, and then it fail again, and then you try, and eventually that you achieve success. And this thing that for a while there looked like it was a huge albatross around your neck and was the worst idea you ever have, turns into a huge a victory and a real triumph. And so everybody who has seen the show really identifies with it on that level. So that's been good.
So it sounds like it's really resonated. Those themes that you've just touched on have really resonated with people.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing too is that just thematically, talking about the relationship between these 3 faiths, I remember thinking at one point in the process, like, oh man, it's taking me so long. Nobody's going to care. Everything's going to be all fixed up between them, and there's going to be no conflict, and it's not going to be in the news or in the public zeitgeist at all, and it's just not going to matter. Then, of course, you fast forward to today, and it matters very much, and it is really prominently in the news, and we're talking about it all the time. And so there is that element and that aspect of the show as well, is that idea of looking at these 3 faiths, the Abrahamic faiths, and seeing that in fact they are incredibly similar, and they're all saying the same thing. And how can we build on that? How can we use those things to knit us together as opposed to pull and tear us apart?
So it sounds like it's recognizing the conflict, but also raising or also reflecting on the common ground, because I think it's certainly a lot of the dialogue I'm hearing, whether it's the Abrahamic faith or whatever the conflict is, it's very easy to other
Yes.
the other person and not see the humanity, the commonness between the other person or the other people and yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. That idea of fear of the other, that's where the problem is. Fear is the key. Most of our problems today are because of fear. We do things because we're afraid, and we turn people into the other because we don't know them, and so we fear them, and we do that. They're not doing it. If we put some effort into getting to know people and looking for those connections we have, I think what we'll find is that we are much more similar than we are different. And I think that's the secret to getting along and to moving forward. And I think it's in today's society, it's a bit disheartening. I think is a very gentle way to put it, about how much fear there is in the world, and the rise of othering and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and anti-trans and homophobia, and all these things seem to be having their flames fanned. When it's just depressing that we're going in the wrong direction, and the irony is that those approaches are making everything worse. And in fact, what we need to do is not to push people away, but to bring them closer and to find out more about them, and to realize that they are just like us. And what can we do, and how can we help, and how can we solve these problems, as opposed to how do we shut doors and push people away and turn people into the other, which is incredibly destructive.
Which makes me think, just reflecting on what you're saying, that the stitch glass triptych and the show that you talked about, which I believe you're talking about the Knitted Pilgrim show, although it's kind of, had a 15-year journey in some ways, is still very timely, is still very, very relevant today as perhaps it was 15, 20 years ago.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what's so interesting about it. It's a really challenging show to describe to people, because they don't, they think, what, the Knitting Pilgrim, like, what's that about? How do these three faiths and knitting about them and talking about God and religion, how does that apply to me at all? And I've had people say to me, I'm like, I don't want to see that show. I don't know. I think your show, no, I don't want to see it. And then they have seen it, and sometimes they use some very strong words about it that they're not polite. And then after they see the show, they say, "Wow, that was fantastic. That was not at all what I thought it was going to be. It was great. I didn't want it to end. I loved it. It was so. It spoke right to me. It was so interesting and so important. Everybody should see the show." So, it's got a very universal appeal, and I think it is about the human condition. It's about all of us and how we think and how we feel and how we get along, and it is, it's applicable to everyone and all the time.
And in the show, because I did it in the introduction, mention that, people kind of knit in shows and that sort of thing. So is that part of the experience of the Knitted Pilgrim kind of theater?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, one of the things that I think is so great about knitting and craft is that it's simple. Anybody can do it, and like all complicated things, it's really not very complicated. It comes down to two stitches. Knitting is just two stitches. It's a knit stitch and a purl stitch, and one is just the inverse of the other, right? So, like a purl stitch is just a knit stitch from the other side, or from in the other direction. That's all it is. But with those two stitches, with this binary system, you can do just amazing things just by the different ways you can combine them. It's like binary mathematics. Like, if you want to program a computer, you use a 0 and a 1, and that's it. That's all computer programming is a 0 and a 1. Yet you can do incredible things. So I think that's part of how accessible knitting is. That you have these very simple techniques, and then you can have amazing results, and anybody can learn how to do it. In fact, in the Knitting Pilgrim, we actually teach people how to knit. We do a knitting workshop, and we have balls of yarn and needles there for people to pick up and use, take back to their seats, and they can work on their own knitting if they brought their own knitting project, or if that's too complicated, takes too much effort, they want to watch the show easily, they can just knit a quick swatch back and forth as they watch the show, and then they can leave that. We invite them to leave that with us, and then we will turn it into something afterwards that they can use. So that's a possibility for them too, and it is in some ways encouraging the audience to work together and to work with me to create something that wasn't there before, something that is beautiful and has a function and symbolism that that we can that we can all see, something tangible. And in fact, I mentioned this another project that I did recently that is the Patchwork Pride Project. It was a similar thing in that I invited people to just knit a 6-inch square, a colorful 6-inch square, a very simple pattern, and to send it into me, and then I would sew them all together into a big to a pride flag. And the reason I'd done this is I previously crocheted a huge rainbow tree sweater or a tree wrap, which was called yarn bombing, and it was enormous. It was it covered the maple tree in the front yard of our church, and the maple tree is over 100 years old, and so it's like 12 feet in circumference. And so I had this enormous 12 feet high rainbow wrap around the tree, and we had it up there for Pride Month, I think in 2023, and the neighborhood loved it, and people would come and they'd take pictures of themselves with it, and it was great. Then one day I got some news that someone had torn it down, which was too bad, and ripped it all up and tearing it off the tree. So that was disappointing. But I took that, picked up the piece, and I fixed it over the next winter and spring, and then we put it back up again the following year, 2024. But this time it lasted less than 24 hours before someone tore it down again, and this time they stole it. So And actually, I had a couple that happened to another similar but smaller rainbow flag in another park in Toronto too. So I was very disappointed by that, and well, actually, my wife was telling me I was enraged. She would say I was so annoyed, and I didn't know what to do about it. And I make this joke that it was kind of like. My response was sort of like what Bugs Bunny used to say in the Looney Tunes commercial, Looney Tunes cartoons, when someone would annoy him. He'd say, "Of course, this means war," and then he'd come back and would completely destroy them. So that was sort of the way I felt about this. I just wanted to fight. I wanted to cover everything in rainbow knitting and stuff. But we took some time to think about it and thought, well, that's not really a great response. And I didn't really know what to do, that I could do as a response. And so I put the word out to the knitting community online and anybody I knew and invited them to participate and say, hey, why don't you if you could send me this little square, we'll put it together into a rainbow flag that we'll hang from somewhere, somewhere in the church. And I thought I'd get like a couple hundred of these things and make a little flag. But it turned out over a period of 2 or 3 months, we got over 1,000. We had over 1,000 squares come in. And so the flag that I thought was going to be very small turned out to be about 12.5 feet wide by 22.5 feet long. The thing was enormous. And we put it all together, and we had to get, we had to have a piecing party one Sunday. We got people come in to help sew it together, and we had so many squares that they couldn't do it all at once. And so over the next week, a bunch of people, I think a core group of about 10 of us, worked morning, noon, and night to sew the thing together and to put a backing on it and to figure out a way to mount it. And we mounted it on the spire or the bell tower of Morningside High Park Presbyterian Church in Toronto. And it was gorgeous. And, in looking back at that was such a huge success because it wasn't just me. It was an entire community that produced it. It was a group effort, a community effort. that no one person could have done by themselves. And we used people of all different ages and skill levels. And, we had someone to figure out how the engineering about how to get it up there and how to hang it properly and how to sew it onto this backing and what to use as the backing. There was somebody who'd made kites before. So she said, well, what about ripstop nylon? They make kites with it. Great idea. Let's source that and put that up. And so this incredible group effort. And when we stood back and looked at it, I mean, it was so meaningful because, whoever tore that original yarn bond down off of the tree, I mean, they were, it was kind of low. They went low. Whereas it encouraged us to go high in a number of ways. One was just elevation. The piece we finished was so high up, no one could touch it. So that was one thing. But also, we took the moral high ground and we got together and created something big and beautiful and community-oriented. Whoever that vandal was who tore it off the tree was trying to stop that or crush that or say something terrible about the LGBTQ community. And yet, we came together and said something beautiful. And so the final result was exactly the opposite of what that act of vandalism was trying to accomplish. And that, I think, was probably the thing I'm proudest of.
So instead of pulling you down, it kind of rose you up, really. You kind of reacted saying, no, actually, we're going to rise higher.
Yeah.
And is that piece of work, so the reason why I came across you, or how I came across you, was there was that piece of work for Pride in London, England, yes, on Canada House, which is the Canadian High Commission in London.
Yes.
And that's how I came across you, because the Canadian High Commission kind of posted something about it. So is that the same piece of work that you created?
That is the very same piece of work. And we were very fortunate. So I think we installed it in Toronto in June of 2025, and then we had to take it down at the end of the season. And then we were in London, Claire and I, working on a theatre tour. It's actually for the Knitting Pilgrim. And we were speaking to one of the people at the High Commission, and they were talking about, and we were actually at Canada Day, and they said, we also have Pride Day right afterwards, or just before, I think, and we said, well, we've got something you could use for Pride Day, and they just loved the idea. So it was great, yeah.
So it sounds like you were in the right place at the right time to get that to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Alison Gooding was the trade commissioner who helped us with that. And so, yeah, it was fantastic. She was a huge champion. And if it weren't for her, we never would have had that project installed.
And did you get much public reaction, or did you get much feedback from the public when that was installed?
Yeah, I think we got a lot of positive. Actually, So what happened was we put it up, and then of course the social media stuff went out, and Canada House put something out on Instagram, and there were a bunch of people feeding back to it right away. It was fantastic. And third down was 3 hearts, and they came from Dame Judi Dench. So we thought, okay, we have arrived. Look what we did. So that was nice. Yeah,
you've made it.
Yeah, we made it.
I also want to touch on your podcast, the Knitting Pilgrim Talks.
Great.
Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, the thing that I did with those 3 stained glass windows, it was I incorporated imagery in. I guess each window was made primarily of the main symbol of that particular faith. So for Judaism, there was a Star of David, and for Christianity, the cross. And then in Islam, there was the star and the crescent. And then inside those symbols, I placed positive images of the faiths. And then outside those symbols, I placed the images that were a little more challenging, and that sometimes referred to things that the faith had done in the past that they're trying to live down, or things where they've knocked heads together, or they're having trouble with each other, things like that. So, like for example, in the Christian window, there's off to the side and outside the cross, there's an image of a Star of David in behind some barbed wire, and that was referencing the poor performance of the Christian Church during the Holocaust, because the Catholic Church, particularly in France, supported the Nazis, and that's about as unchristian as you can possibly be. So things like that That, and then also, but there's so much to choose from as far as positive things. Images go and about peace and caring for each other and all those kinds of things. But I didn't really have time to address many of those images in the show, The Knitting Pilgrim. And people after the show would come up and see these huge pieces of work, and they'd say, wow, I'd love to know what all these images mean. And I just didn't have enough time to tell them right then and there. So we decided to create a podcast where I would take some time and speak to a scholar or a minister or a rabbi or imam about one particular section and the images that were there and the kind of the question I was asking with those images or the things or the theme I was exploring. So that's what the Knitting Pilgrim Talks is a series of episodes where we're trying to deal with each individual section of the tapestries and discuss the imagery that is brought to light on those tapestries.
So it sounds like a really nice accompaniment to the theater production as well. So it kind of allows you to explore things in a bit more detail.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing that's good about the podcast is I'm not the one who's saying them. I'm basically asking the questions, and then we're hearing from somebody who has much more experience and knowledge than I can talk about, what's out there and the actual facts about things and the difference between what people think and what it was actually these faiths are actually saying and their histories together and what they mean and where these ideas come from. So for example, in Judaism, there's this idea that women are not allowed to do certain things like wearing a prayer shawl or blowing a shofar, which is a ram's horn that's blown on certain holidays, or wearing tefillin, which are small pieces of the Torah that are attached to the wearer's arms with straps and they're used for praying. And all these things, I was under the impression that women weren't allowed to do these things. And in fact, when you look at Judaism and go right back to the beginning, it's actually saying, no, women are actually excused from doing this. They do not have to do them. They're not obligated to do them because they are often doing a much more important things, which is caring for a family, raising a child, all those sorts of things. So they are not obligated to take time away from that more important work to do these other things. Whereas men who are not obligated to do those things in particular necessarily, who are not giving birth to anyone or that kind of thing, they are expected to fulfill these prayer functions. So it's not a thing that women aren't allowed to do them. It's just that they were excused from doing them. And could women do them? Yeah, absolutely they could. So it's these kind of misunderstandings that we have of the faith that I think are really important.
I'm now coming to my final question, but I'm just reflecting on kind of what we've talked about. And, the projects you've been involved with are some, quite frankly, big, like the stitched glass, the theater production, your podcast, and even, the pride flag that, turned out to be a very community participatory thing. Those are fairly big things. And dealing with subjects that are timely, and I think they've been timely for quite a few decades, to be fair, and going forward. What's next? Because it just feels like you've achieved so much already, but it also sounds like there's potential for a lot more as well.
Wow. Well, that's a great question. One of the things we're doing, I'm in the middle of doing right now, is that my wife Claire and I have written another play, and it's based on some of the research that we found in researching the Knitting Pilgrim. And that was that, in the Second World War, apparently there were women who in Europe who spied on the Nazis for resistance, and they knit code into socks, and they would spy on the Nazi troop movements and knit this information into code and into a sock and then send it to the resistance. And we thought, wow, that's a really cool thing, using knitting as a spy craft. So let's write a show about that. And we did. And we're trying to find some original source material. Like we're trying to find some knitted items that had code knitted into them that were, passed around. We couldn't actually find anything. So we're not sure if it actually happened, but it was such a great idea that we created a character who worked for Winston Churchill's spy agency, the Special Operations Executive. And she is a middle-aged woman who knits. And so she's completely invisible, which makes her a great spy. Like, no one would think this woman would be a spy. She's just sitting around knitting. And yet she could, she had incredible powers of deduction, and she would notice things. And so she made an excellent spy. And that's what we did a show about that called Spycraft. And we're now in the middle of producing that. To add to that, this character is also a hidden Jew. So there's that, and that additional jeopardy for her to be in occupied France, spying on the Nazis as a hidden Jew working for the English. So that show is going to go up in this fall here in Canada in October, November, and we're really looking forward to that. And I've also just been approached by the folks at I think it's called The Connections, which is a group out of St. Martin in the Fields in London, off Trafalgar Square. They saw the Patchwork Pride because it was right across the square from them, and I went by and did a little workshop with them when I was in town. And they have invited me to participate in a project they are starting, which is called the Threads of Remembrance. I think this is what it's being called at the moment, and it's about remembering all the people, the homeless people who have died while being homeless in the UK. And I think there's just an incredible number of people. It's 1,400, 4,000, something like that. Anyway, it's a shocking number, and they would like to create a memorial blanket. And so they want to knit a square for every person who has died while homeless in the UK. And we've been talking about that, and they've asked some advice, and I'm happy to help with that. I'm hoping to get over there at one point to help piece it together and get it up and help with that. So that's another thing I think that I'm looking forward to doing. And that's a project that really excites me because, again, it's a community project. It's addressing a huge societal issue. That's something that, it should not be happening, is happening, and we need to come together to fix it. So I find that very exciting.
Yeah, and that sounds like a really, really interesting project. And sadly, homelessness and poverty is, unfortunately, at the moment increasing across the world. It's not just a UK thing. But yeah, it's the Connection at St. Martin in the Fields, and it's a charity in London that it does outreach to the homeless and vulnerable people in London. So yeah, no, I've heard of it, and I think a lot of Londoners are familiar with it. So it sounds like a really great project to support what they're doing.
Great, yes, yeah, we're pretty excited by the whole thing.
Well, great. It's been lovely speaking with you, and I've found your story really quite interesting and fascinating, to be fair. So thanks for being a guest.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Heather. I really appreciate you taking the time. And I am honored to be noticed and on your show. And thank you for making the effort to get these artists' stories out there, because I think art is incredibly important. It's actually something that we all aspire to, and something that lifts our lives and that we all need. And so thank you for doing such a tremendous job in helping us discover it and honor it.
Thank you. And I agree with you. I think art is fundamental to humanity, and it's great to have, I have to say, it's great speaking with the artists that I speak with. Thanks for tuning into my conversation with Kirk. I hope you enjoyed hearing about his vibrant storytelling through yarn, and his reflections on empathy, faith, and social justice left you as inspired as I was. If this episode sparks something in you, be sure to check out Kirk's website and social media handle, and the links are in the show notes. And if you're enjoying Artist Tales, help us keep the momentum going by sharing the podcast with your friends and fellow creatives. In the next episode, I'm speaking with Jeff Titley, a digital media artist and photographer who blends traditional photographic techniques with cutting-edge digital processes. Jeff's art explores the technological lens through which we view the natural world. It's going to be a fascinating dive into how digital tools reshape visual storytelling.